The Saloon Girl's Reckoning, a Western tale of redemption in 1880s Texas. Chains of dust and shame. The sweltering Texas heat pressed down on Dry Creek like a heavy blanket, and inside the Rusty Spur Saloon, the air hung thick with tobacco smoke and broken dreams. Rose McKenna wiped the sweat from her brow as she scrubbed the sticky floors, her calloused hands moving in practiced motions that had become as natural as breathing. "Rose, get over here and serve these gentlemen," barked Silas Hartwell, the saloon owner, his yellowed teeth gleaming through his greasy mustache. His voice carried the weight of ownership, not just of the establishment, but of her. She straightened her aching back, smoothing down her worn blue dress that had seen better days before she'd ever laid eyes on it. The fabric clung uncomfortably to her fuller figure, but it was all she had. In Dry Creek, dignity was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Coming, Mr. Hartwell," she replied, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. The three men at the corner table looked up as she approached, their eyes scanning her with the casual cruelty of men who saw women as commodities. One of them, a thin man with pale eyes, sneered. "Well, well, ain't you a sight for sore eyes, darlin'?" Rose forced a smile, the same practiced expression she'd worn for the past 3 years. "What can I get you, gentlemen?" "Whiskey all around," the pale-eyed man said, his gaze lingering on her with uncomfortable intensity. "And maybe some company later." "I'll get your drinks," Rose said firmly, turning away before he could respond. As she walked back to the bar, she caught sight of herself in the cracked mirror behind the bottles. Her auburn hair, once her pride, now hung limp and lifeless. Her green eyes, which her mother had always said sparkled like emeralds, now held the dull sheen of resignation. At 26, she felt ancient. "Your debt's grown again, Rose," Silas said quietly as she poured the whiskey. "Interest keeps adding up." Rose's hand stilled on the bottle. "How much now?" $437. The number hit her like a physical blow. When she'd first arrived in Dry Creek, desperate and alone after her father's death, she'd borrowed $50 from Silas to pay for her room and board. That was 3 years ago. Despite working every day, scrubbing floors, serving drinks, and enduring the advances of drunken men, the debt never seemed to shrink. "That's impossible," she whispered. "I've been working. Room and board ain't free, girl. Neither is the food you eat or the clothes on your back." Silas's voice was matter-of-fact, as if discussing the weather. "You want to leave? Pay what you owe." Rose's jaw tightened. She'd learned the hard way that arguing with Silas was pointless. The books were his, the numbers were his, and in a town where the law was bought and paid for, justice was a foreign concept. Through the saloon's grimy windows, she could see the dusty main street of Dry Creek. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded her of the home she'd lost. Somewhere out there was a life she'd never known, a life of choice, of dignity, of hope. "I'll get back to work," she said quietly, taking the whiskey glasses to the waiting men. As the evening wore on, the saloon filled with its usual crowd of cowboys, drifters, and locals. Rose moved among them like a ghost, serving drinks and deflecting crude comments with the skill of long practice. But tonight something felt different. Maybe it was the way the setting sun had reminded her of better times, or maybe it was simply that she'd reached the end of her rope. Sheriff Clayton Morse pushed through the swinging doors just as the clock struck 9. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and imposing, with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. His star gleamed dully in the lamplight, and conversations quieted as he entered. "Evening, Sheriff," Silas called out with false cheer. "Usual. Just coffee tonight, Silas." Rose felt the sheriff's eyes on her as she worked, but she didn't look up. Clayton Morse was as crooked as they came, taking bribes from Silas and the other business owners to look the other way on their less savory dealings. He was part of the machine that kept her trapped. But as the night wore on, she began to notice something strange. The sheriff's usual swagger seemed subdued, his shoulders carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. He sat alone at a corner table, nursing his coffee and staring into the darkness beyond the windows. When she finally approached to refill his cup, he looked up at her with an expression she couldn't read. "You're Rose McKenna," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir. Your father was Thomas McKenna, had a small ranch east of here." Rose's breath caught. No one in Dry Creek had ever mentioned her father. "You knew him?" "I knew him." Clayton's voice was heavy with something that might have been regret. "He was a good man, honest." The words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. Rose felt tears threaten, but she blinked them back. She couldn't afford to show weakness, not here. "Will there be anything else, Sheriff?" Clayton studied her face for a long moment, and Rose had the strange feeling he was seeing her, really seeing her, for the first time. "No," he said finally. "That'll be all." As Rose walked away, she didn't see the sheriff's hands clench into fists on the table, or the way his jaw tightened as he watched Silas counting money at the bar. She didn't see the war playing out behind his weathered features. or the way his eyes followed her with something that looked dangerously close to shame. The night stretched on, and Rose continued her work, unaware that across the room, Sheriff Clayton Morse was having the first honest conversation with his conscience in years, and in the morning, everything would change. The weight of a badge dawn broke over Dry Creek with the promise of another scorching day, but Sheriff Clayton Morse had been awake for hours. He sat on the porch of his small house on the outskirts of town, watching the sun paint the horizon in shades of gold and crimson. The coffee in his cup had gone cold, but he barely noticed. Sleep had been elusive, filled with dreams of Thomas McKenna, a man he'd respected, a man he'd failed. The memory of their last conversation echoed in his mind like a haunting refrain. "Clayton, you're a good man," Thomas had said, his hand firm on the younger man's shoulder. "This town needs someone like you wearing that badge." That was 15 years ago when Clayton had first pinned on the sheriff's star. He'd been full of righteous purpose then, determined to bring justice to a lawless frontier town. But somewhere along the way, that purpose had eroded like sandstone in a windstorm. Clayton stood and walked to his dresser, where a photograph sat in a simple wooden frame. The image showed a younger version of himself standing next to a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Margaret, his wife. She'd been dead for 8 years now, taken by a fever that swept through the county. Since then, he'd been drifting, making compromises he'd never imagined possible. "What would you think of me now, Maggie?" he whispered to the photograph. The answer came to him in her voice, as clear as if she were standing beside him. "You know what's right, Clayton. You've always known." He dressed slowly, the weight of his badge feeling heavier than usual as he pinned it to his vest. The walk to town took him past the cemetery where Margaret lay buried beneath a simple headstone. He stopped, as he did every morning, and removed his hat. "I think I'm ready to be the man you married again," he told her quietly. The main street of Dry Creek was already bustling with activity. Merchants swept their storefronts, cowboys watered their horses at the trough, and children ran between the buildings with the carefree energy of youth. To an outsider, it might have looked like any other thriving frontier town. But Clayton knew better. He knew about the bribes, the fixed poker games, the girls working off impossible debts. He knew because he'd allowed it all to happen. His first stop was the general store, where Mrs. Patterson was arranging bolts of fabric in the window. "Morning, Sheriff," she called out cheerfully. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Yes, ma'am, it is." Clayton paused at her doorway. "Mrs. Patterson, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the truth." The woman's smile faltered slightly. "Of course, Sheriff. What is it?" "The McKenna Ranch. When Thomas died, what happened to it?" Mrs. Patterson's face went pale. She glanced around nervously before speaking in a lower voice. "Sheriff, you know what happened. The bank foreclosed when he couldn't pay his debts." "What debts?" Thomas McKenna was as honest as they come. I don't know the details. You'd have to ask Mr. Hartwell. He handled the transaction." Clayton's jaw tightened. Of course Silas had been involved. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. You have a good day." As he walked away, he heard her call after him. "Sheriff, be careful." The warning followed him as he made his way to the Cattleman's Bank. The institution stood proudly at the center of town, its brick facade a testament to prosperity built on questionable foundations. Inside, the air was cool and tinged with the scent of leather and money. "Sheriff Morse." Franklin Kessler, the bank president, rose from behind his massive oak desk. "What brings you here so early?" "I need to see the records on the McKenna Ranch foreclosure." Kessler's smile became strained. "Now, Sheriff, you know those records are confidential. Banking business and all. This is official business, Franklin." "I'm afraid I can't." Clayton's voice cut through the banker's protest like a blade. "I'm not asking, Franklin. I'm telling you, get me those records." The authority in his tone, absent for so many years, seemed to surprise them both. Kessler swallowed hard and nodded. "Of course, Sheriff. Give me a moment." As Kessler rummaged through his files, Clayton studied the man who'd helped orchestrate so many of the town's dirty dealings. The banker was sweating despite the cool air, his hands shaking slightly as he pulled out a thick folder. "Here it is," Kessler said, his voice barely above a whisper. Clayton opened the folder and scanned the documents. What he saw made his blood run cold. The debt listed was 3 times what Thomas McKenna had actually borrowed, inflated by mysterious interest charges and administrative fees. The foreclosure had been rushed through in a matter of weeks, with no notice given to the family. "This is fraud," Clayton said quietly. "Now, Sheriff, that's a strong word." "It's the right word." Clayton closed the folder and tucked it under his arm. "I'll be keeping this. You can't just—" "I can, and I am." Clayton's steel-gray eyes fixed on the banker. "And Franklin, if you breathe a word of this to anyone, I'll make sure you stand trial for fraud. Do we understand each other?" Kessler nodded frantically, his face the color of ash. Clayton's next stop was the land office, where he spent an hour poring over property records. The picture that emerged was clear and damning. a systematic scheme to defraud honest ranchers of their land, orchestrated by Silas Hartwell and enabled by corrupt officials, including himself. By the time he walked back onto the main street, the sun was high overhead and the heat was becoming oppressive, but Clayton barely noticed. His mind was focused on one thing: making things right. He found Rose McKenna scrubbing the steps of the Rusty Spur Saloon, her movements mechanical and weary. She looked up as his shadow fell across her, squinting against the bright sun. "Sheriff," she said cautiously. "Miss McKenna, I need to speak with you privately." "I'm working, Sheriff. Mr. Hartwell doesn't like—" "This is about your father's ranch." Rose's hands stilled on the scrub brush. Slowly, she looked up at him, and Clayton saw something flicker in her green eyes. Hope, maybe, or perhaps just curiosity. "What about it?" "Not here. Can you meet me at the church tonight after sunset?" Rose hesitated, glancing nervously at the saloon's entrance. "I don't know if I can." "This concerns your freedom, Miss McKenna, your father's legacy, everything that was stolen from you." The words hit their mark. Rose's spine straightened, and for a moment Clayton saw a flash of the fire that had been banked but never extinguished. "I'll be there," she said quietly. As Clayton walked away, he felt the weight of his badge again, but this time, it felt like an anchor rather than a burden. For the first time in years, he was going to use his authority for its intended purpose, to serve justice. Behind him, Rose McKenna continued scrubbing the steps, but her movements had changed. There was purpose in them now, and strength. The ember of hope that had been flickering in her chest began to burn a little brighter. Neither of them noticed Silas Hartwell watching from the saloon window, his eyes narrow with suspicion and calculation. Whispers in the chapel. The old wooden church sat at the edge of Dry Creek like a forgotten prayer. Its whitewashed walls turned silver by the moonlight. Rose McKenna approached cautiously, her heart hammering against her ribs. She'd told Silas she was visiting the outhouse, but if he discovered her absence, there would be consequences. The church door creaked as she pushed it open, and she stepped into the hushed darkness. Pale light filtered through the simple windows, casting long shadows between the rows of wooden pews. She'd been inside only once before, on the day of her father's funeral, when the whole town had turned out to pay their respects to an honest man. "Miss McKenna?" Rose spun around to find Sheriff Morse emerging from the shadows near the altar. He removed his hat and gestured to the front pew. "Thank you for coming. Please sit." Rose perched on the edge of the pew, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "You said this was about my father's ranch." Clayton sat beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. He pulled out the folder he'd taken from the bank and set it between them. "Your father was cheated, Miss McKenna. Robbed as surely as if someone had held a gun to his head." Rose's breath caught. "What do you mean?" "The debt that forced the foreclosure on your father's ranch was fabricated, inflated beyond anything he actually owed. The whole thing was a scheme to steal his land." As Clayton explained the fraudulent documents, the rushed foreclosure, and the conspiracy that had stolen her inheritance, Rose felt a familiar fire building in her chest. But this time, instead of the helpless rage she'd carried for 3 years, it was something else, something focused and determined. "Who?" she asked quietly. "Who did this?" "Silas Hartwell orchestrated it. Franklin Kessler at the bank helped. And I—" Clayton's voice faltered. "I was supposed to serve the foreclosure papers. I should have questioned it, should have investigated, but I took their word for it." Rose studied his profile in the moonlight. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I've been a coward for too long. Because your father deserved better. Because you deserve better." Clayton turned to face her fully. "And because I think we can make this right." "How?" "The ranch is gone. My father is dead. I'm trapped in that saloon with a debt that grows every day. The ranch can be recovered. The land records show it was sold based on fraudulent documents. As for your debt," Clayton hesitated. "How much does Silas claim you owe?" "Over $400 now." "For a $50 loan 3 years ago?" Rose nodded, and Clayton's jaw tightened. "That's not legal debt, Miss McKenna. That's slavery." The word hung between them like a physical presence. Rose had never heard anyone name it so plainly, but she recognized the truth of it immediately. "Even if that's true," she said quietly, "who's going to enforce the law? You?" The question cut deep, and Clayton felt the weight of his failures like a physical blow. "Yes," he said finally. "Me. Why should I trust you? You've been taking bribes from Silas for years. Because you're right to doubt me." Clayton's voice was raw with honesty. "I've been everything you think I am. Corrupt, weak, complicit. But I'm tired of being that man. I'm tired of dishonoring my badge and my wife's memory." He stood and walked to the altar where a simple wooden cross caught the moonlight. "I made a vow when I married Margaret. I made another when I took this badge. I've broken both and I can't take that back. But I can try to make amends." Rose watched him in the pale light, seeing something she'd never expected to see in Clayton Morse. Genuine remorse. "What are you proposing?" she asked. "I'm going to arrest Silas Hartwell on charges of fraud and human trafficking. I'm going to shut down his operation and free everyone working under false debts. And I'm going to make sure you get your father's ranch back. And when the town council objects, when the other business owners complain, when Silas offers you more money than you've ever seen," Clayton turned back to her and Rose saw steel in his eyes. "Then they'll learn that Sheriff Clayton Morse remembers what his badge means." Rose stood and walked to join him near the altar. "It won't be easy. Silas has friends, people who profit from his schemes. They won't just let you walk in and arrest him. I know. You could lose everything, your job, your reputation, maybe even your life. I've already lost everything that mattered to me. My integrity, my wife's respect, my own self-respect." Clayton's voice was steady now, filled with a quiet resolve. "I've got nothing left to lose except the chance to do something right." Rose studied his face in the moonlight, looking for any sign of deception or weakness. She'd learned to read men in her 3 years at the saloon, to spot the tells that revealed their true intentions. But in Clayton Morse, she saw only a man who'd found his way back to his principles. "What do you need from me?" she asked. "I need you to be strong a little longer. I need you to go back to the saloon and act like nothing's changed. And when the time comes, I need you to be ready to testify about what Silas has done. He'll kill me before he lets me testify, not if I arrest him first." Rose nodded slowly. "When?" "Tomorrow night. There's a poker game at the saloon. High stakes, out-of-town players. Silas will be distracted, focused on the money. That's when I'll move. And if something goes wrong?" Clayton reached into his vest and pulled out a small derringer, its pearl handle gleaming in the moonlight. "Can you use this?" Rose took the weapon, feeling its weight in her palm. "My father taught me to shoot when I was 12. Keep it hidden. If things go bad, get out of town. Head east to the county seat and tell the federal marshal what's happened. What about you? I'll either restore justice to Dry Creek or die trying." Rose slipped the derringer into her dress pocket, then extended her hand to Clayton. "Partners?" He took her hand, and Rose felt the calluses of honest work on his palm. "Partners." As they prepared to leave the church, Rose paused at the door. "Sheriff, why did you really decide to help me?" Clayton was quiet for a long moment. "Because your father once told me that a man's measure isn't in his mistakes, but in what he does to fix them. I've spent 8 years making mistakes. It's time to start fixing them." They slipped out into the night separately, Rose returning to the saloon and Clayton to his lonely house. Neither of them slept well, but for different reasons. Rose lay awake with hope and fear warring in her chest, while Clayton spent the night cleaning his guns and writing letters he might never send. In the morning, everything would look the same in Dry Creek. But beneath the surface, the ground had shifted. The reckoning was coming, and with it, the chance for redemption or destruction. The poker game. The Rusty Spur Saloon had never seen a night quite like this one. Word had spread through the territory about the high-stakes poker game, and players had come from as far as Dallas and San Antonio. The air was thick with tobacco smoke and tension, and the usual crowd of cowboys and drifters had been replaced by well-dressed gamblers with cold eyes and expensive guns. Rose McKenna moved through the chaos like a ghost, serving drinks and trying to remain invisible. The derringer in her pocket felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, and every sound made her jump. Across the room, she could see Sheriff Morse sitting at the bar, nursing a whiskey and watching the proceedings with deceptive calm. "Rose," Silas Hartwell's voice cut through the noise like a whip crack. "Get over here and bring these gentlemen some of the good whiskey." The poker table was surrounded by 6 men, each more dangerous looking than the last. Silas sat at the head of the table, his oily smile wider than usual as he counted a stack of bills. To his right sat a thin man with pale eyes, whom Rose recognized as Jake Morrison, a gunfighter with a reputation for violence. The others were strangers, but their expensive clothes and cold stares marked them as serious players. "Certainly, Mr. Hartwell," Rose said, forcing her voice to remain steady. As she approached the table with the whiskey, she caught fragments of conversation that made her blood run cold. "2 more girls coming in from Austin next week," Morrison was saying. "Young ones, pretty, should work off their debts real quick. That's the beauty of the system," Silas replied, dealing cards with practiced ease. "They never quite manage to pay off what they owe." Rose's hands trembled slightly as she poured the whiskey, but she kept her expression neutral. This was worse than she'd imagined. Silas wasn't just keeping the girls in Dry Creek trapped. He was actively trafficking new victims. "What about the sheriff?" one of the strangers asked. "He asking questions lately?" Silas's smile faltered slightly. "Clayton Morse has been bought and paid for so many times he don't remember what questions look like. Nothing to worry about there." Rose glanced toward the bar where Clayton sat and saw his jaw tighten at the casual dismissal. Their eyes met briefly, and she saw something dangerous flicker in his steel-gray gaze. "Besides," Silas continued, "even if he grew a conscience, who's gonna believe him? Half the town council's in on this operation. The other half's too scared to speak up." "Still," Morrison said, his pale eyes scanning the room, Might be worth putting him in the ground just to be safe. Now, Jake, that's a bit extreme. Silas chuckled. Clayton's useful. He keeps the other law dogs from sniffing around. Rose finished serving the drinks and retreated to the bar, her heart pounding. She'd learned enough to know that Clayton was walking into a trap. These men wouldn't hesitate to kill him if he threatened their operation. The night wore on, and the stakes at the poker table grew higher. Rose watched from the corner of her eye as thousands of dollars changed hands, money that represented the stolen dreams of countless victims. The other saloon girls, Mary, barely 18, and Sarah, who'd been brought in from New Mexico under false promises, served the players with the dead-eyed resignation of the truly trapped. At midnight, during a brief lull in the action, Rose saw Clayton stand up from the bar. He adjusted his gun belt and walked slowly toward the poker table, his spurs jingling softly on the wooden floor. "Evening, gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his badge. "I'm Sheriff Clayton Morse, and I'm here on official business." The conversation at the table stopped abruptly. Silas looked up with a forced smile, but Rose could see the worry in his eyes. "Clayton, what brings you over here? Care to join the game?" "I'm here to place you under arrest, Silas." The words fell into the silence like stones into still water. Every eye in the saloon turned toward the confrontation, and Rose felt the tension ratchet up another notch. "Arrest?" Silas's laugh was high and nervous. "What for? Fraud, human trafficking, racketeering." Clayton's voice was steady, but Rose could see his hand resting on his gun. "The game's over, Silas." Jake Morrison's chair scraped against the floor as he stood up, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon. "Sheriff, you might want to reconsider. This here's a private game among friends." "Sit down, Morrison," Clayton said without taking his eyes off Silas. "This doesn't concern you." "Everything in this room concerns me," Morrison replied, his pale eyes glittering with menace. Rose saw what was about to happen a split second before it began. Morrison's hand flashed toward his gun and Clayton spun to face him. The two men drew simultaneously, their movements fluid and practiced. The gunshot was deafeningly loud in the enclosed space. Morrison's weapon flew from his hand as Clayton's bullet shattered his wrist. The gunfighter screamed and dropped to his knees, clutching his ruined hand. "Anyone else want to try?" Clayton asked, his smoking gun now trained on the other poker players. The strangers at the table were professionals. They knew when the odds had shifted against them. One by one, they raised their hands and leaned back in their chairs. But Silas wasn't finished. As Clayton turned back toward him, the saloon owner's hand disappeared beneath the table. Rose saw the glint of metal and realized he was going for a hidden gun. "Clayton!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. The warning came just in time. Clayton dove to the side as Silas's bullet splintered the chair where he'd been standing. The sheriff rolled behind the bar as Silas fired again, the bullet shattering bottles and sending whiskey cascading to the floor. "You made a big mistake, Clayton," Silas yelled, his composure finally cracking. "You think you can just waltz in here and upset the natural order of things? This town belongs to me." "Not anymore," Clayton replied, rising from behind the bar with his gun ready. But Silas had moved, using the chaos to position himself behind Rose. She felt his arm wrap around her throat, felt the cold metal of his gun pressed against her temple. "Drop it, Sheriff, or the girl dies," Silas snarled. Rose's mind raced. She could feel the derringer in her pocket, but with Silas holding her so tightly she couldn't reach it. Around the room, the other patrons had scattered, seeking cover behind overturned tables and chairs. "Let her go, Silas," Clayton said, his gun still trained on them. "This is between you and me." "No, it's not," Silas replied, his voice venomous. "It's about order. It's about knowing your place. You forgot yours, Clayton. You forgot that you work for me. I work for the law." "The law?" Silas laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "I am the law in this town. I decide who lives and who dies, who stays and who goes. And I decide that you've outlived your usefulness." Rose felt Silas's grip tighten and she knew he was about to pull the trigger. But in that moment she remembered her father's words. "Sometimes, Rose, you have to fight for what's right, even when you're scared." With a surge of desperate strength, Rose threw her elbow back into Silas's stomach. The impact wasn't enough to seriously hurt him, but it loosened his grip just enough for her to break free. She dove to the floor as Clayton's gun roared. Silas Hartwell staggered backward, clutching his chest. His eyes were wide with shock and disbelief, as if he couldn't comprehend that his carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. This isn't over," he gasped, blood frothing on his lips. "Yes, it is," Clayton said quietly. Silas collapsed beside the overturned poker table, his blood mixing with the spilled whiskey on the floor. The money that had been the center of so much corruption, scattered like leaves in the wind. Rose picked herself up from the floor, her hands shaking but her spirit somehow steady. Around the room, the other saloon girls were emerging from their hiding places, their faces filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "It's over," Clayton announced to the room. Anyone who wants to leave is free to go. Anyone who wants to stay and rebuild this town the right way is welcome. As the survivors began to sort themselves out, Rose walked over to where Clayton stood reloading his gun. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you," he replied. "If you hadn't warned me, we're partners, remember?" Clayton smiled, the first genuine smile Rose had seen from him. Partners. Outside, the first light of dawn was beginning to creep over the horizon. It would be a new day in Dry Creek, and for the first time in years it would be a day of hope. The price of justice dawn broke over Dry Creek like a revelation, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise redemption. But inside the Rusty Spur Saloon, the harsh reality of the previous night's violence cast long shadows across the scattered poker chips and broken glass. Rose McKenna sat on the front steps of the saloon, watching as Clayton Morse organized the aftermath of the shootout. The bodies of Silas Hartwell and Jake Morrison had been wrapped in canvas and loaded onto a wagon, while the surviving poker players sat in shackles waiting to be transported to the county seat for trial. "Miss McKenna?" Dr. Samuel Brennan, the town's physician, approached with his medical bag. "Sheriff Morse asked me to check on you. Are you injured?" "I'm fine, doctor," Rose replied, though her hands were still trembling slightly. "Just shaken up." Dr. Brennan was a kind man in his 50s, one of the few people in town who had never treated Rose with anything but respect. He'd been her father's friend, and she could see the mixture of relief and concern in his eyes. "I'm glad you're safe," he said quietly. "Your father would be proud of what you did tonight." Before Rose could respond, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention. A group of riders was coming down the main street, led by a man wearing a badge that gleamed in the morning sun. As they drew closer, Rose could see that it was Marshal William Cross, the federal lawman who had jurisdiction over the territory. "Sheriff Morse," Marshal Cross called out as he dismounted. "I received word about some trouble here." Clayton emerged from the saloon, his shirt still stained with blood and his face grim. "Marshal Cross, good to see you." "I wish I could say the same about the circumstances." Cross was a tall, lean man with graying hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "I understand there was a shooting." "Self-defense," Clayton replied. "Silas Hartwell was running a human trafficking operation. When I tried to arrest him, he and his gunfighter friend started shooting." Marshal Cross nodded toward the shackled poker players. "And these gentlemen?" "Accomplices. I've got evidence of their involvement in the trafficking ring." For the next hour, Rose watched as Clayton laid out the case against Silas and his network. He presented the fraudulent bank documents, the evidence of forced labor, and testimony from several witnesses. Marshal Cross listened intently, asking pointed questions and taking detailed notes. "This is extensive," the marshal said finally. "You've been thorough, Sheriff." "I had help," Clayton replied, glancing at Rose. "Miss McKenna here was instrumental in exposing the operation." "I see." Marshal Cross studied Rose with interest. "You were working in the saloon?" "Against my will," Rose replied firmly. "I was held in debt bondage, forced to work off a fraudulent loan that kept growing no matter how much I paid." "And the other girls?" "The same. Mary and Sarah are both trapped by fake debts. There are others in different businesses around town." Marshal Cross made more notes, then looked up at Clayton. "Sheriff, I'm going to need you to come to the county seat and give a formal statement. This case is going to require federal prosecution." "I understand. There's something else," the marshal continued. "The territorial governor has been getting reports about corruption in several towns along the frontier. What happened here last night? Taking down a trafficking ring, standing up to corruption. It's exactly the kind of law enforcement we need." Clayton's jaw tightened. "Marshal, I haven't been the lawman I should have been. I took bribes, looked the other way, and then you made..."